welcome to History 300, The Origins of the First World War. Lecture 7, Imperialism and Economics. In 1916, while living in exile in Switzerland, the Russian revolutionary Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, better known to history by his adopted name Lenin, published a pamphlet called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. In this pamphlet, Lenin argued that the war is imperialist, that is, an annexationist, predatory war of plunder on the part of both sides. It is a war for the division of the world, for the partition and repartition of colonies and spheres of influence of finance capital. Capitalism has grown into a world system of colonial oppression and of the financial strangulation of the overwhelming majority of the population of the world by a handful of advanced countries. And this booty is shared between 2 or 3 powerful world plunderers armed to the teeth, who are drawing the whole world into their war over the division of the booty. In the years since Lenin wrote Imperialism, many historians, not all of whom were or are Marxists, have more or less echoed the thesis of this pamphlet. It's frequently argued that imperial rivalries between the great powers, driven by the need to secure access to raw materials and markets for manufactured goods, were the underlying reason for the conflict that broke out in 1914. Germany's imperial rivalry with France and Britain is often cited as a principal cause of the war. In this lecture, we will consider the place of imperialism in the years immediately leading up to the First World War, and more broadly at the economic factors which may or may not have played some part in stoking tensions between the great powers. There's no question that the 30 or so years before 1914 saw a dramatic upsurge in imperial activity around the world. Some European great powers already held very large imperial territories even before then. During the preceding centuries, Great Britain had conquered or occupied all of what is today India, Pakistan and Sri Lanka, much of Burma, Malaysia and Singapore, Hong Kong, Australia and New Zealand, South Africa, portions of modern Somalia, Nigeria, Ghana, Gambia and Sierra Leone, Gibraltar and Malta, Canada and Newfoundland, Belize and Guyana, and many of the Caribbean islands. France controlled Algeria and Tunisia, Senegal, southern Vietnam and Cambodia. Russia had expanded eastwards across Central Asia, so that its borders now extended as far as China and the Pacific Ocean, Afghanistan and Iran. But during the period from around 1880 to 1912, European colonialism occurred at an even more frenetic rate. In 1880, only about 10% of Africa's territory was directly controlled by Europeans. By 1912, 90% of it was. Outside of the Americas, virtually all of the remaining independent non-European states of the world were absorbed by the imperialists by 1914. Only the Ottoman Empire, China, Ethiopia, Iran, Thailand and Japan remained. And apart from Japan, which had successfully remodeled itself as a Western-style colonizing power in its own right, none of these states was in particularly good shape. Aside from the traditional European colonial powers like Britain, France, Russia, Spain, Holland and Portugal, other nations also got in on the act during this scramble for territory from the 1880s onwards. Belgium's King Leopold II used privately contracted explorers and soldiers to carve out for himself a huge colonial territory along the Congo River in Central Africa, a colony many times bigger than Belgium itself. The Italians attempted, without success, to conquer Ethiopia, and later, with more success, were able to acquire modern-day Libya. And the new German Empire too sought overseas colonies of its own. By 1890, German imperialists in Africa had obtained what are today Tanzania, Namibia, Cameroon and Togo, while in the Pacific they took control of much of New Guinea and several island chains such as the Solomons, the Marshalls and the Marianas. Compared to the British or the French empires, however, the German colonial empire was small beer. Although it was a respectable enough size on a map of the world, much of it was scarcely inhabited wasteland or jungle. German enthusiasts for empire bridled at this knowledge and looked on the British and French empires with a mixture of admiration and resentment. Aside from humanitarian claims about bringing civilization and true religion to the poor benighted natives, the chief argument for the necessity of imperialism made by its advocates back home in Europe was economic. Any great power worth its salt, they argued, had to secure for itself raw materials to feed the manufacturing industries of the home country and markets in which to sell those finished goods. As one French statesman put it at the time, to remain a great nation, or to become one, you must colonize. Now, to what extent there really was an economic benefit to empire, in the way that Lenin took for granted, is a vast and complicated subject that we haven't really got the time to get into here. But it's worth perhaps pointing out that at least some European leaders didn't buy into the idea for a moment. Germany's Iron Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, for instance, was perhaps the most important of these colonial skeptics. To Bismarck, the German colonial empire was simply a waste of time, energy, and money. By the 1880s, Germany was already becoming an economic giant, not through trade with Africa, but through trade with other European nations and with the United States. Colonies had nothing to do with Germany's rise to power one way or the other. Bismarck only dabbled in African and Pacific imperialism because he saw it as a way of buying support from nationalist politicians in the Reichstag. He had no faith that the colonies he acquired had any intrinsic value of their own. After Bismarck was dismissed from office by the new Emperor Wilhelm II in 1890, however, the situation changed. Wilhelm was a true believer in the imperialist worldview, and he dearly wished to plant the German flag as far across the globe as possible. The problem was that by 1890 there just wasn't that much easily obtainable colonial territory left to grab. Wilhelm's imperial enthusiasm led him into a conflict with France over the status of Morocco in 1905 and again in 1912, and also he encouraged his plan for a large German navy, which led to the Anglo-German naval race in the North Sea from 1898 onwards. To what extent, then, can we say that European imperialism played a direct causal role in the outbreak of the First World War? Certainly, Germany's desire for Weltmacht, world power, brought it into confrontation with France and Britain. But the main cause of Franco-German rivalry had nothing to do with imperialism. The French cared far more about the lost provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, taken away from them in 1871, than they ever did about some real estate in North Africa. It was the Franco-Russian alliance that frightened the Germans, not France's control of Indochina. Similarly, what worried the British about the German naval build-up was not that the Kaiser might try to seize India, but that he might try to land an army in southern England. In other words, for all of the heated rhetoric about global imperialism during the years before 1914, it was always European, not colonial issues that really energised the great powers. It was the balance of power on the European continent that mattered when it came down to it, not what the map of Africa or Asia looked like. The secondary nature of colonial rivalries is well illustrated by the Anglo-French and Anglo-Russian ententes of 1904 and 1907. During the 1890s, Britain had come very close to war with France and Russia over quarrels about control of the Upper Nile and Southwest Asia, respectively. If either of these disputes had resulted in conflict, then it really would have been a war about imperialism. But what is striking is how relatively quickly and easily all these powers were able to settle their colonial differences when they felt it was necessary to make common cause against Germany. In fact, the British were actually open to assisting the Germans with the expansion of their colonial empire because they hoped that this might reduce the tension between the two powers that had been set off by the naval race in the North Sea. Shortly before the outbreak of the First World War, there was some serious discussion between London and Berlin about the idea of Germany purchasing Portugal's African colonies. Portugal was on the verge of bankruptcy at the time. Or perhaps acquiring some or all of the Belgian Congo. Neither of these plans came to anything, and admittedly, it is always easier to bargain away someone else's empire rather than your own. But the British genuinely admired German colonial administration, and they hoped that a larger German empire would mean a more satisfied and thus less dangerous Germany. The problem was that, if anything, Germany seems to have been losing some of its former enthusiasm for world empire by the eve of the First World War. Its failure to advance its claim over Moroccan territory in 1912 seems to have convinced the leaders in Berlin that bids for Weltmacht in Africa brought nothing but trouble. Plus, the cost of the naval construction programme, which was always rhetorically linked to the idea of overseas empire building, was becoming prohibitive. German expansionist plans were beginning to shift instead towards economic control of Central and Eastern Europe. The idea was floated of a Mitteleuropa free trading zone dominated by German industrialists. This shift in ambition would make Russia, rather than Britain or France, Germany's principal foe. And that would be easier for the Chancellor in Berlin to sell to the influential socialist politicians in the Reichstag, who were far more hostile towards the autocratic Tsar than they were towards the liberal parliamentary governments in the West. In other words, then, by 1914, imperial rivalry outside of Europe was becoming less important as a factor in great power politics than it had been 10 years or even 2 years previously. Leaving aside the imperial question, however, we also need to look at the broader economic rivalry that existed between the great powers before the First World War. There was much talk in Britain, for instance, about the threat which German firms represented to the traditional British commercial primacy in Europe. In 1896, a best-selling book called Made in Germany warned that England's industrial supremacy is tottering to its fall, and this result is largely German work. After World War I, some historians suggested that Britain had seized the opportunity represented by the July crisis in 1914 to precipitate a war against its chief economic rival in Europe, and thus to remove a threat to its own commercial primacy. Certainly, there was much talk in Britain before the First World War about the challenge which German competition represented to British business, and this talk could sometimes be framed in terms of a quasi-military struggle for survival between the two nations. But while businessmen whose profits were directly threatened by German firms sounded the alarm, others who profited from dealings with Germany were just as keen to point out the benefits of mutual trade. The economic relationship between the two nations was not, after all, a zero-sum game in which, for one to prosper, the other had to lose. Britain relied on Germany as much as it was threatened by it. German customers represented Britain's second-largest export market after the United States. While businessmen were alarmed at the prospect of foreign competition, they were even more alarmed at the general collapse in trade that a war would bring about. This was even the case for the so-called merchants of death, the arms manufacturers like Krupp in Germany, Schneider-Krauss in France, Skoda in Austria-Hungary, or Vickers and Armstrong in Britain. These firms made enormous amounts of money through contracts with their own governments to produce battleships, guns, and other weapons of war. But they also made enormous amounts of money selling armaments to foreign powers, and they were well aware that whatever short-term profits would be made by wartime contracts would be more than offset by the loss of overseas markets due to the general disruption in trade caused by war. There was, then, little enthusiasm amongst businessmen for war in 1914. Indeed, when the British government closed the London Stock Exchange on July the 31st, 1914, for the first time since it had been established in 1801, there was panic among investors, worried that they would be ruined by a general collapse of the world financial system. A delegation of investors went to see David Lloyd George, the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, or Treasury Minister, imploring him to keep the UK out of any continental conflict. After the war, Lloyd George wrote in his memoirs, "There are those who pretend to believe that this was a war intrigued and organised and dictated by financiers, who ascribe our action in 1914 to the irritation produced by a growing jealousy of Germany's strength and prosperity. It is a foolish and ignorant libel to call this a financiers' war. In fact, money was a frightened and trembling thing. Money shivered at the prospect of war." Okay, in the next lecture, we'll talk about the role of public opinion in precipitating the war and the place that domestic political issues played in the decision-making of the great powers in 1914. See you then.